Hello and welcome to Hacking Health. My name is Waylon Gomez. I'm your host, and I'm a holistic trauma coach who decided that there was way too much myth and mystery around how to truly heal from trauma, not only in the scientific community, but also in the spiritual community. So I created Hacking Health as a podcast that merges together spirituality and science to better the lives of our listeners. This podcast is for you if you're someone who is struggling to overcome their mental health hurdles, or if you're someone who really loves science and understanding how things work. It's even for you if you're someone who's on a spiritual path that loves understanding the bigger picture of things through an esoteric and philosophical lens. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and ding that notification bell. That way you don't miss a single episode. And let's dive right in. So I'm thinking, where I'd like to start would be just kind of talking a little bit more about what your upbringing was like. I know that you grew up pretty heavily involved with the church, and just wanted to see if you'd be comfortable kind of sharing with the audience a bit more about what that journey was like for you growing up in the church. I mean, you grew up pretty heavily in the church, right?
Yeah, I was a part of the church since I was in utero.
Okay.
My mother is she is a pastor. My father is an organist at a church. So both of my parents, that is their profession. And when you have both of your parents who work in the church, you spend your entire life growing up in the church because there's no daycare. You just go to church when your parents are at work. So I was going to church while I was still inside of my mother because she preached up until the Sunday before I was born. And I was the child of the church. Every church that I ended up going to, I think my mom, during my growing up years, she's taught at 3 different churches. Not taught, she's preached at 3 different churches. My father has played music at 2 different churches. And it was interesting because I grew up very much with everybody surrounding me, almost like it was a second family. And I feel like my experience with religion is very unique and very different compared to the average person who attends church, whose parents are extremely devoutly religious. Because there's extra layers to it whenever you have parents who work in the church, especially one who is a minister. And it's interesting because my mother, who was the minister, she always encouraged me to have thoughtful conversations surrounding religion. I'm grateful that I didn't have parents that really shoved any ideology down my throat or forced anything really upon me, but there was always this expectation of attending church, setting an example. Even though that was never explicitly said, there was a lot that was kind of just expected of me. I grew up basically having a job in the church, but not getting paid because I was the pastor's kid, and you kind of just...
So that was a really big part of it, was like that you kind of worked
Oh,
at
yeah,
the church?
absolutely, yeah. Depending on if I went, I would go back and forth each Sunday to my mom's church or my dad's church to get an even amount, because my mother taught at a Lutheran church and my father played at a Presbyterian church. And my mother, I believe she's the more religious of the two parents, and she knew my dad needed help sometimes with getting things set up every week, but she also wanted me to be involved within the Lutheran branch of Christianity. So I was baptized Lutheran and confirmed Presbyterian, so I like to say that I was Presby-Lutheran. So I'm kind of this big mishmash. I have always kind of just been adopted into any space that I go into. And I don't know, it's been an interesting experience growing up that way because everybody knows who you are. They know what you're doing. When I come home and visit now, it's like I'm a celebrity. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, how have you been? We've missed you. What's new? This and that. And like, everybody already has an aspect of understanding of my life and what I'm doing because my parents will share that with people, and them being prominent figures in their churches. It's weird because you're almost like this little celebrity.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, I mean, part of my curiosity with that is, do you find that when you go back now they see you as you were or as you'd like to be seen? Because I know when we look at the whole idea, even just of, like going home for the holidays, sometimes it's really hard for us to be in a place where our parents can see us in a different light. And I wonder if growing up in the church, you find that now going back, that there's, do you find that people see you as you really are now or as you want to be seen? Or do you feel like they kind of see you as just this little girl who's,
When you
was part of the
say
church?
how people see me, are you referring to my parents? Are you referring to members of the church, or both?
I guess technically both. I think more my curiosity came about with members of the church. I
Yeah.
don't know if necessarily you still, when you go back to the church. But I know that the times that I've been there with you, since again we are a couple, I know we've gone back there. And that's always just been a curiosity to me is, do you feel like you're being seen for fully who you are outside of that circle? Or do you feel like those kind of old emanations of the identity come back?
I really think that it's in no malicious intent do people see me the way that they've always seen me and not as I am now. But I do oftentimes feel as though when I return to the church, I I'm obviously respected as an adult and they don't talk to me like I'm a little kid, but there is this you go away for a period of time and then you come back and you've grown and people only have a frame of reference of who you are from the last time that they saw you. And so sometimes it can be a little bit jarring. Um, and I feel as though I am still very much seen as like, oh, you're the kid. You're the kid of the church. And I don't ever feel like I'm being talked down to, but I also know that people are going to see you in the frame that they see you and choose to see you. And to answer your early question, yes, I do continue to go back to the church whenever I go home and visit. My dad still needs a lot of help, especially as he's getting older. I like to, help him out because I know that, a lot of the work that he does involves some manual labor, and I don't want him to, have to do it by himself if I'm there and I can be a helping hand. So I will oftentimes go back and help out, and that's usually when the celebrity bombardment happens. But I mean, it's kind of fun. It's a really interesting dynamic. There's definitely the feeling of I'm being seen as who I am, but also I recognize growing up, never really showed the fullness of who I was. So when I go back as I am now, I feel as though I have done a ton of work on myself. I've come to understand who I am so much more, have more of a sense of self, more self-expression. I'm getting older, I'm growing up, I'm developing this for myself. And as a kid, I only showed sides of myself that were proper in its place. And I feel like I'm finally coming into this place as an adult and as my own individual person, as I know that I'm imperfect and I want to show up authentically, not correctly. So I'm obviously going to be seen differently now, and there's probably going to be juxtaposition between the way that I'm viewed now as I was when I was a kid, because as a kid, I wasn't even showing up as me.
So I want to talk about that real quick because you brought up this whole idea of showing up authentically versus correctly. Can you talk a little bit more about what the difference is between those as you see them now, and how that's kind of changed over time as you've developed what that authenticity is versus the correctness?
For sure. And I think we've talked about this a little bit just between the two of us. As a slight disclaimer, I can't really separate my experience in the church from all the experiences that I've had outside of the church. And so obviously, everybody has their own unique collage of experiences that shapes those perspectives. For me, I grew up neurodivergent without people recognizing that I was neurodivergent. And there's lots of layers to that, and I'm still sort of coming to realizations for myself within that. But through that, I had to do a lot of masking in everyday life, not just in the church, in school. I was a dancer, so in dance classes, everywhere that I went, I was masking to some degree. And I really do believe that being in church shaped a lot of my masks. And church has, the purpose of church for a lot of people is moral compass. And there's a lot of talking about what is morally right, what is morally wrong, how to be a good person. And that's a lot of what's taught, for instance, in like Sunday school. I was always in Sunday school. And so growing up as a kid, I have always had black and white thinking, one extreme or the other. And growing up hearing stories of, clear characters that are very good or very bad. And it's not just like, oh, bad, get a slap on the wrist. It's like, bad, you're damned to hell. And the church that I was in, what the type of ministry that my mother was a part of, by no means, it was not a fire and brimstone. The world is going to crumble around you. You sin once and you have to, pay for your atonement. Like, it wasn't that kind of preaching. But there is always the undercurrent of that, no matter what the branch of Christianity is, no matter how wonderful, how accepting, or how progressive a minister is. There is always going to be undercurrents of that, because that is what I believe a lot of the face of modern day Christianity has undertones of that.
And if I can ask, what do you think the reason is that undertone is always there? Because I know I've noticed that just in my own kind of journeys into Christianity and whatnot, that there's almost this kind of like unspoken word of like, you better, make sure you're doing things properly, or you're going to hell. But we don't say that, but there's just that feeling of that.
Yeah.
What do you think the reason behind that is?
Well, I mean, there's branches that are more covert and more that are overt within that, and more that is a key aspect of the religion, and there are other branches that is, like we said, like the undercurrent of that. But there's always this like slight subliminal messaging of that. It's always slightly tucked in there. And I think this is the case for any organized religion. I truly believe that organized religion was created initially in its inception as a way to bring people together under the guise of one spiritual belief, to unite people, to give people collective faith, because in truth, I do consider myself a very spiritual person. I don't personally like to ascribe to any one religion. I personally believe that all religions are telling the same truth and the same message. Right. But it's by congregating in the ways that we're congregating, there's a lot of, well, in order for this thing to exist, there needs to be people that aren't a part of that in order for this to be the identity. And I think we're kind of coming into an era, in a day and age, where we have technology and the ability to connect with people, but also so much crazy stuff happening in the world, right, that those barriers are actually, people are using that almost as like fortress walls to prevent themselves from being hurt, because there's a lot of craziness going on in the world. So if you can keep it us versus them, and we want to bring more in people to the us so that we have more to ostracize with the them, I'm of the belief that the more that we tear down the walls, we can actually band together and create a better world together when we stop criticizing each other. I forget what the initial question was. I kind of went off on a tangent.
That's okay. I mean, welcome to podcast where we go off on tangents. That's part of the purpose. But I do want to kind of reel back on something that you said when it came to the idea of just breaking down these structures and these constructs. Because one of the things that I noticed for myself, growing up, where it wasn't something where I was like inundated in religion, but when I went into these different places like mosques or Hindu temples, or even just like Catholic churches, Christian churches, New Age churches, all these different places, I had this really weird experience. And I'm not entirely sure whether it was just me masking and also being autistic, that played into that. I'm sure that was a part of it. But the other part that I remember noticing was that there was this collective understanding of what was right and what was wrong, and it kind of had its own language. And it was very interesting to be an outsider and to start to see that some of what I was noticing was almost this disillusionment, if you will, this idea of like, we're going to come here and we're going to congregate and we're going to put on this persona that only exists here in this space, and then we're not going to take that back with us, and we're not going to integrate that. And my curiosity is, growing up, did you notice that, or was it something where it was almost like the blinders were on until you got out of that experience?
You know, I feel like I was always kind of aware of those things. I was always the kid that I think I got away with it a lot because my parents were working in the church, but I was always questioning things. Like for confirmation classes, I got it out easy when it came to confirmation classes, because some branches of Christianity, it's like months and months, and you're doing service projects. Like it's intense. My confirmation was extremely quick and painless and very easy. It was like 4 like half-hour meetings over the course of like 2 months.
Okay.
Like it was really, really, it wasn't too crazy elaborate. And within that, I was always asking questions. I was always questioning things. I always came into everything with a healthy dose of skepticism. Because I felt like comfortable in the church, and my mom always told me, like, oh, you used to run around. You were always like you ran the joint, like you were really comfortable in there. I always felt like I was physically comfortable because I knew every nook and cranny of the church because I grew up in it. It was like my jungle gym. It was a second home. But when it came to the actual ideologies, I was always questioning things, and I noticed what, like you said, like the difference, almost like people put on a different persona when they walk into the space.
Right.
I remember as I was getting around like 11 or 12, which is around the age that you start like starting to understand things to it, like a more complex idea than just like good, bad, right, wrong, and you start to question things. So around that questioning age, I remember seeing and hearing conversations out in like the lobby area of the church before people would enter into the chapel or into the big sanctuary space. And I remember hearing conversations between, especially like the older women in the church, which that's very much a stereotype.
It is. I'm like waiting for the church gossip stereotype.
Yeah, like it's a thing. It really is a thing.
Totally
At least from
a
my
thing.
experience in the churches that I've been a part of, there's always been some levels of gossip because you bring people together and that's what happens.
It's a human phenomena.
Exactly. And like I'm not shaming anybody for it, but it's interesting because I always felt like there was this weird thing where people were acting like people, and then they would go into the church and everybody sits and they're quiet and they listen and they're good, and it feels like everyone's in school again.
Yeah.
And like you're in school and everybody's very solemn and quiet, and I'm sitting with these things, and then the service is over. The music, they don't even wait for the music to be done playing, and they're like state break, and it's completely different. And you're back to life. Or maybe it lasts a little bit till everybody trickles back out, and then somebody will pull out their phone and they'll start talking about something that's on their phone.
Yeah.
Or like, not to say like, oh, the purpose of like religion should be like this thing that we all carry around, this great like walking around like pious nature. But I also don't think that it's necessary to have that pious nature when you're in the space. I think we should be
agree.
people.
Human.
I feel like there needs to be more rawness, more authenticity, more expression, more humanity in religious in spaces. And I don't want to say like, oh, we need to reform religion. But
do you feel like that's welcome in those spaces?
I think it depends on the church. Because I definitely, in some churches, they have like Bible study groups or groups where people gather together and they have, theological or philosophical conversations, usually surrounding, they'll choose a specific verse from the Bible and they'll focus on that, or they're working on a certain book in the Bible and they're working through it every week. And there are groups that are like that where they start to have more in-depth conversations, like really sitting down and breaking down how does this apply to my life? What does this actually mean? How is this applicable? And maybe I just never really was at the age to really be welcomed into those spaces, because that was usually, the adult spaces. It's like adult Sunday school, but it doesn't happen on Sundays. It's usually like a random day of the week in the evening after everyone's done with work. And so I wasn't really invited into those spaces because I was a kid. Why would a kid be invited to those spaces? And those usually aren't run by, sometimes the minister runs it, but usually it's, members of, some sort of committee that decide like, oh, we should have this Bible study group, or someone in the church just decides. And I think it could be extremely beneficial to take the concept of questioning and sharing and rawness and expression and bringing that into the collective space of the religion, rather than just an isolated little group of people who decide they want to take things further. I think that true faith and true religion happen when we question.
I would agree.
Like contemplation and questioning is a key aspect of this, because I believe that blind faith is just, kind of crossing our fingers and hoping for the best.
Right. I mean, it's blind.
Yeah. And when I speak to somebody, and I don't intend to insult anybody with this, but when I speak to somebody, and when you get that inkling of like, this feels like blind faith. This feels like I'm just saying this because I've been taught this. I'm not saying this because I've lived this. I'm not saying this because I inherently, very deeply within the core values of myself, know this to be true. There are certain people, when you speak to them, and I didn't really come across this in the churches that I was a part of, but I still look at my experience with religion and Christianity from a lens of how it's portrayed in the media, how I've heard conversations go, how I've had conversations with people. When I was a college kid and I'd pass somebody on the street who was not televangelizing, but evangelizing on the street, or getting into those deep, late night conversations, sitting on your kitchen floor at 2 a.m. with people, contemplations of religion kind of conversations. And I take all of that into consideration when I view my lens of Christianity, all of those aspects, because I think it's all a part of it. But I really do wish that there was more thoughtful conversation, and it wasn't just sitting down, listening, saying the same things every week. I always felt like church services felt like school. And I know that like ministers and preachers, they go to school, they get a master's in theology. Like they studied for this. But I also think about, there's a difference between elementary school and primary school education versus higher education, even beyond undergraduate. But when you get to like master's and doctoral level, it's not so much lecture. It's a lot of like, you're sitting down and researching, you're contemplating, you're looking at all of these ideas and trying to bring them together and come to your own ideas, and you share them with people, and then people challenge you and you have to stand by what you have to say, and sometimes it changes your perspective. And in that aspect, that's part of the reason why I love what you're doing with this podcast, is bringing together concepts from the scientific perspective, from, education, scientific, and religion, spirituality, faith, all of these things, and bringing it together, because I do think that holds a lot of merit, and I really hope that that's the next evolution of what humanity views as faith.
I'd like to think that it could be. And it's, when we look at this whole idea of school too, I have always been curious, I don't necessarily always hold the best idea in my head of like, or I don't hold the idea of school as it's done now to the highest regard or degree. But I also think it's curious because you look at this idea of the way that religion is approached when it comes to Sunday school and whatnot, and the level of curiosity that's there. I think it depends on how much the students believe that they're allowed to be curious. And, if I can share just an experience that I had that I thought was it hurt me at the time, but now it's almost a little bit funnier. When I was younger, I ended up going to a New Age Christian, New Age, I mean...
Like born again Christian?
Like born again televangelist, crazy amounts of money. Like they had a shuttle for the parking lot level of craziness. There were 10,000 people on average that showed up. And
Mega church.
They had the ability, I think, to house 50,000 people.
Mega church.
Mega church. So what was crazy about it was I was not old enough to be in the normal sermon area, so I had to go to Sunday school, but my brother and we were traveling to Florida to hang out with my aunt. And my mother was there, so she went to the actual service, and then we ended up getting split because he was 3 years younger than me, so he stayed in the one and I was in the other. And I specifically remember everything about it was not very welcoming. Like when I got into the Sunday school, they were like, okay, everybody pull out your Bibles. And I was like, well, I didn't bring a Bible because I figured I would just be going to the sermon, so I don't have my Bible on me. And that was like strike one, the fact that I didn't have a Bible on me. So it was like, oh, you know what? There's ones in the back that you can get. And as we kind of continued through this, I specifically remember that what I said was actually what got me kicked out, quite literally, I kid you not. So we were supposed to write down prayers, I think, if I wasn't mistaken, that were on like a Post-it note. Mm-hmm. And the idea was we were supposed to write down a prayer and we were supposed to kind of like give them to the teacher, and then the teacher would read them out and decide, it kind of seemed like, whether they were good prayers or bad prayers, like whether the efficacy of the prayer was there, whether it was what we should be praying for. Again, when I talk about the idea of indoctrination, right, this is like the start of that. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I specifically remember I didn't write down a prayer. I left it blank and I just put my name on it. And the teacher was, again, remember, I was already the trouble child because I didn't have a Bible. So needless to say, I end up going and having to explain myself because she kind of calls me out and she's like, Waylon, why didn't you write down a prayer? And I looked at the whole idea of this Buddhist philosophy, which I had been taught by my mother and by the different Buddhist traditions, that was about this idea of wanting to, instead of just praying for things, take action upon them. Because the realization was that the greatest prayer is the one that we set an intention for and then take an action. But prayers aren't something that we should just kind of put out there and hope that come to us. They're things that we should take action on in our daily life. And I specifically remember what she told me was, well, that is the work of the devil. And if you believe that, then you're going to hell. So get out of my class. I mean, she was one step away from calling me a heathen, basically.
Heretic.
And so I literally got kicked out. And I think I was like 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And then I had to go back to the normal sermon space. And it was just this realization of like, I had an idea. Now, mind you, this Sunday school teacher was probably only, I don't know, maybe 20, 22 years old. So that poses another kind of thing, which is, should we have someone who's 20 or 22 years old who can't even necessarily handle their own emotional shit, then trying to teach children?
But yeah, the efficacy of that whole there's so much during that whole escapade that's questionable.
But the reason I bring it up is just because that was a thought that stood outside of the normal thoughts and was seen as something that was demonized, which brings me to another kind of question for you. Did you find that as you were growing up that there were certain things that came about in your own personal experience? I know that we've talked about you growing up homosexual. And how was that received, knowing that so many of these ideas can be kind of demonized? I hope you're enjoying this episode of Hacking Health. Now, if you're someone who's been struggling with trauma or being able to put these pieces together of your life, if you're someone who feels like you're stuck in life and you can't move forward and you just can't seem to make progress on your own, it may be time to hire a professional. I offer free 1-hour trauma resolution calls to anybody who's interested. This is a completely free service, and my goal in this call is to really get you lasting results. In this call, we'll not only talk about some of your goals and where you've had these struggles, but I'll help you to get to the root core of where these problems are and give you step-by-step plans of how we can work together to change that so that you can overcome your mental health hurdles and really become the person deep down inside that you know that you can be. So if you're ready for your life to change, if you're ready for you to take hold of your life and be in control once and for all, then go ahead and click in the link in the description below and let's set up a free 1-hour trauma resolution call. That way we can work together to form a plan for you to overcome your mental health hurdles once and for all. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel yet, make sure that you hit that subscribe button and ding that notification bell so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for watching this episode of Hacking Health. Remember to stay curious and stay tuned for part 2.